All right, everybody, welcome. Want to start a little bit early, that way everyone has time to get the supplies that they're going to need for today's lesson. So you are going to need a few things. All right, you're going to need a regular pencil, you're going to need an eraser. This is going to be a watercolor-based lesson, but you can also do this with colored pencils as well. If you're using watercolor, right, try to get some nice watercolor brushes. You typically want more of a rounded tip for watercolor, okay? You're gonna need watercolor palette, okay? And then you're also going to need a dark colored pencil. I recommend black. You could also get away with dark brown. You could do ink if you wanted to as well once everything is fully dried. And if you're doing this with colored pencils, I'll also show you how to do that as well, in which case you're just going to need a colored pencil set. All right. Alrighty, so let's get started. We're going to be doing a watercolor animal portrait, just like this one. It's a great chance to learn how to play with watercolor drips in a very sort of like controlled manner, okay? So ideally you should have something like this by the end, okay? You're also going to need watercolor paper if you're doing watercolor. If you try to do this with printer paper, the paper is just going to disintegrate and you're going to get a hole in the middle of it. So you need something thicker. It can either be watercolor paper, it could be Bristol, it could be cardstock. As long as it's thick and it's going to be able to withstand a lot of water, you're going to be able to do it. Okay? But first things first, like anything, we have to start with a sketch. This is the reference that I'm going to be using today. You're welcome to follow along with this one, or if you're feeling adventurous, you can find your own as well. All right, and as always, if you have any questions, you can either send us a direct message on this platform, or you can send us an email afterwards. Right now, Friday's schedule is completely open, so if you have any suggestions, feel free to send us an email. But as always, we're going to think about a few things when we get started, right? We're going to think about basic shapes, we're going to think about center lines, we're going to think about proportions. And as I mentioned on Monday, we want to keep our lines really light. This is especially true when working with watercolor, because watercolor is a translucent medium. That just means that whatever we put on the bottom, when we put watercolor on top, you're going to be able to see through, okay? It's not opaque like other types of paint where you can't see what's underneath. So you want to keep your sketch really light because all of your lines are going to show through when we do the watercolor on top, okay? So if I take a look at this picture, if I want to break it down into the basic shapes that I have, we're working with a big circle for the head, right? I'm going to say that this snout is kind of like a triangle, right? Like a teardrop triangle shape. Okay, you could also do it as an oval if you really wanted to, okay? I'm going to say that these ears are like really big triangles, okay? Next thing we have to do is we have to check our proportions, right? Make sure everything matches, okay? So a big thing that I'm noticing with this is that the ears extend almost all the way down to the mouth, right? We don't want to draw really short ears, right? We got to draw really big, long ears. And also the width of these ears, they're almost the width of the face, too. They're about 2/3 of the face, maybe. So we're going to need really long, wide, triangular ears. And this one's going to be a little bit shorter, right? Because the face is turning away from us. So to start, right, I'm going to make this fairly big so I have more room to work with the watercolor. I'm going to start with a nice, light, big circle, right? And then we have that little sort of teardroppy, oval-y shape that I mentioned. And I'm keeping it really light and loose so I can also make changes as I go. Remember we talked about how the ears really wide. I'm going to measure out 2/3 with my fingers, bring it over. Just need to make this a little bit wider. All right, and it needs to come all the way towards the bottom. All right, and this one, same thing, but it's going to end just a little bit higher, okay? Next thing we also check is our center lines, right? So a center line is just if we were to draw an imaginary middle line down the face, okay? So that it's symmetrical. on both sides. Symmetrical just means it's the same on both sides, okay? So if I look, my center line is kind of this diagonal, right? It's not a crazy strong diagonal, but it's also not upright. Sort of a happy medium between the two. And also it's not right in the middle of the face. It's a little bit over to the right side. We're seeing more of this left side than this right side. So we want to put our center line a little bit past the halfway point and give it a diagonal. Just like that. Now we have to think about imaginary middle lines, okay? So if I was to draw an imaginary middle line to divide this face in half, big thing that I'm noticing, right, is that my eyes, the majority of them, are above that middle line, right? So if I draw my imaginary middle line across here, okay, my eyes have to be above this line, okay? And just like we discussed on Monday, your eye line, okay, it's always perpendicular to your center line, and that just means that it forms a right angle with it, like a nice little cross. All right, I can bring this down a little bit further. I made it a little bit too strong. All right, now I have to think about eye placement, right? There's a pretty big distance in between these two eyes, right? They're both pretty close to the edges of the face, okay? So I'm gonna bring the outline of this ear over and I'm gonna say, okay, my eye needs to start around here, okay? I'm gonna do just a nice little mark out where I want this eye to be, okay? Then I'm gonna work over from this side and I'm gonna say, okay, I want my eye to be kind of around here. All right, a little bit of room at the side, and I can always scooch this in as I work. But we wanna make sure that we're leaving enough distance in between them. All right, so again, imaginary halfway line. If I draw that line in half again, right, if I look at a quarter, my nose starts around the quarter mark, okay? So here's my another imaginary halfway line. My nose is pretty far down, right? I also want to leave a little bit of room for the upper part of the nose, right? Because this is sort of the top of the nose, this is the side, bottom of the nose. Okay? Now that I have all of this really gently marked out, we're going to start with the actual outline, okay? So we always want to work big to small, so you don't want to start in with the eyes just yet. You want to start about the whole face, okay? So for me, I like to start at the top of the head. And again, I'm paying really close attention. I'm keeping it light, trying to look for where does it curve up? Where does it curve down? Right, see there's a little bump right here. I see that my face kind of comes out, a little bit of a diagonal. Comes back in a little bit. All right, working from the ear here. I'm just following a very gentle curve down and around. Because we already did a lot of blocking out, it's a lot easier for us than if we had to just guess it. And again, I'm working big shapes to small shapes. And I'm paying really close attention to where I see little bumps in the shape. I'm gonna bring this curve down and around. Right, the ear flaps right over here. And as I go, I'm also going to erase some of these guideline marks. That way we're not getting too confused with how many lines we have on the page. We just know exactly what we are working with at any given moment. And if you over erase, that's okay. Again, we want our lines pretty light for this project. I'm gonna work over again from here because this is where I can kind of start seeing the edge of the snout. I'm also gonna check my line up on here. Come slightly down right? Just a little bit off of vertical. Sometimes it's really hard to work with curved lines, so you can make straight lines. So you can check your angles. And then what you do is you just curve them at the end. So already I can see, right, this is a very short distance between the snout and the nose. I'm probably gonna need to scooch my nose down a little bit further. Not a huge amount. I also need to bring it over to the side a little bit more. Right, if I check my vertical lines, if I draw a line straight up, this hits the edge of the eye, right here. If my edge of my eye is here, yeah, I need to bring this nose over. And that's okay, that's why we keep it light and easy, so we can make these changes. Yeah, this needs to be, yeah, it's a much better shape. Right, now we have a flat line here. This curve, okay, it's gonna extend, right, almost to the midpoint of this eye. Okay, now that I kind of like the general shape, I'm gonna start curving out a little bit more. Right, because dogs aren't just straight lines. But because I made straight lines at the beginning, my curved lines look a lot stronger, a lot more precise. Okay, this puppy also has a jaw, a mandible, just like we do. Starts a little bit past that curve, right? It's gonna come down and around, following that same curve that we just did. It's gonna disappear back behind this ear. So we're doing okay so far. While I'm here, I might as well work on this other ear. Okay, so again, we said started kind of halfway down, even actually a little bit closer to the mouth line. Goes down a little bit further. Right, a little curve down. We have a little gap right here. I'm also going to gently mark out where I need certain colors to go, because that's going to help us a lot when we start the watercolor. I'm cleaning up as I go. Also gently marking out where I see any muscles, okay? Because again, that's also going to help us when we start thinking about shading. Right, and you can typically tell where muscles are based on shadows and highlights, right? There's a really strong highlight here. It shows that this part of the snout is coming forward, right? This part's coming forward. It's darker behind here, it's going back. Now that I look at this, I realize, you know what? My eyes are a little high up, so I'm gonna scooch them down. Keeping the same proportions, still keeping the same center lines. Keeping everything the same, I'm just scooching. Like that. Yeah, that's much better. I'll bring the head down just a little bit. Finish off this side over here. Okay, so now that I have all my big pieces done, now I can start thinking about some of the detail pieces, okay? A lot of people, when they start drawing eyes, they think it's just a circle. Eyes are a little bit more complicated than that. So the best way to start, especially with animal eyes, all right, is you want to first determine what's the angle between the upper corner of the eye and the lower corner of the eye. All right, so if I draw an imaginary middle line, it's a pretty strong angle, right? We tend to think of eyes as being pretty flat, but animal eyes especially really tend to curve up. Okay, I can bring my pencil right down here, mark out that line that I'm gonna need. Okay. All right, and then the bottom line is typically a little less curved than my upper lid line, and that's also true for humans as well. All right, so I'm gonna start remembering that this is my upper corner, so I'm gonna gently curve this one down, little tear duct, just like we have. All right, I'm gonna take my upper one. It's already a lot more curved from that line that we made. I'm gonna bring it down, over, just like that. Okay, and animals have irises like we do, so I'm gonna mark out where I see the edge of that iris. There's a little bit of white space, marking out that tear duct right there. I'm also gonna mark out where my eye is really shiny and light. There's no white paint in watercolor, so if you want something to be white and it's really small, you have to just leave it blank. You have to let the white of the paper show through. Also, animals have eyelids like we do, so I'm gonna give him an upper lid. Okay, and we can really see this lower lid quite clearly. Okay, erasing as I go. All right, now to do the other eye. Again, I want to check my center lines. Or if I was to draw an imaginary line from the tops of the eyes, what does that line look like? Okay, which means we got that line right the first time, which is always nice. If I check my bottom line, just gotta bring it down a little bit more. So my eye's gonna fit more into this sort of box. I always like to box out my eyes, that way I know where exactly it has to be. Right, sometimes when people start drawing eyes, they're like, oh, I make it too big, I make it too small. If you draw a box for yourself, then you know, okay, it has to fit where I just put this. Again, checking the line. This one's a really dramatic one, because the eye is turning away from us. It's also going to be a little bit more curved because it's turning away, it's in perspective. Right, so I've got my big U curve. Again, I got my, remember the top one's more curved than the bottom one. It's going to come up, over, connect, right where I drew that line earlier. My box. Okay, mark out my highlight. Okay, this one, you don't really see the eyelid too much. It comes over by the side quite a bit. Got my lower lid. Right, it's going to come right up and over here. A little bit of fur that comes in front of it, but that's okay. Right, in theory you would have little You can mark that out on your paper if you want to, if you want the paint to go around there. And overall, that's a pretty good starting place for us for our watercolor. So again, you really want to lighten up your strokes. What I like to do is I like to take an eraser and just very gently go over my lines. So I'm not getting rid of them. They're just getting lighter, and I'm not pressing all the way down. Just lightening it up so we have a little bit of room to work. You also want to make sure you clear off any eraser bits, otherwise they're going to get caught in the paint and the water as we go. Okay, now it's time to actually start thinking about paint. So if you're unfamiliar with watercolor, there's two components to it. Okay. You have your pigment, right? If you're working from paint with a tube, it'll come out wet. It can also harden like this, okay? And then you also have water. All right, the more water you add to your pigment, the lighter it's going to get. The less water you add, the darker it's going to be, right? Because you have more pigment then at that point, okay? There's also a few different techniques that you can do with watercolor, which I'm going to show you while we wait for this to dry. But first thing we want to do is we want to look and determine where are our darkest areas, right? So if I was to look, I'd say, okay, so around the snout, right? Around the edge of this ear, nose, this bottom part of the nose, part of the eye, okay? A little bit around the bottom of the mouth, okay? And we're doing rainbow colors with this. You're welcome to do natural colors if you really want to. But because I'm keeping it more rainbow, I want to pick a darker rainbow color. So I'm going to be using purple to start with. And we're going to be doing some sort of watercolor drips and splotches. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just take a brush with plain water. Just push it against the side, that way you don't have too much. You don't want puddles of water. You just want like a nice layer. And I'm gonna put down the water just in a nice even layer right where I mentioned those dark areas should be. Okay, water creates a barrier for the paint. It's not gonna go past where that water is, okay? Now with a separate brush, I have one brush just for plain water, I'm gonna mix in over here in my palette, a little bit of water, a little bit of pigment. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna start gently tapping it where I place the water. As it dries, it's gonna spread out, create a really cool effect, just as I showed you on that example. Watercolor also typically dries lighter than it looks here, so you can go a little bit darker in some areas, especially if you really want some emphasis. So I want a little bit more emphasis in here. So what I did was I took a lot of pigment on my brush, very little water, and I'm just gonna let that go for a little bit. All right, remember we talked about how the eyes are gonna be dark? So same thing. This time I'm gonna be a little bit more careful. I'm gonna leave room around where I want the white part of my eyes to be. Same deal. I'm going to take my purple. I'm going to start gently dabbing that in. All right, the paint's not going to go outside of whatever water barrier you make for it. I know, so there's a little bit of darkness up around the eyebrow over here. So again, I'm just gonna dab my purple in. And I'm just gonna slowly work my way across the face, working from darker and lighter sections, okay? Also, if you work while this is still wet, you might get some cool color mixing in between. So let's say I want a little bit of orange underneath the eye, put down my water, clean off my brush, some orange on there. Dab a little bit of water in between. The colors will just start to mix together as they dry. Same thing up here. Right, you can see already I've got a little bit of purple wanting to come down. Dab a little bit of orange. It'll mix together to create a really cool effect. If you're doing this with colored pencil at home, all you have to do is just do a very similar sort of shading technique that we would do in class, okay? So pick your favorite colors. And you're gonna do the same thing, except you're just gonna be blending them with colored pencils, okay? So pretend I'm gonna do blue, and I'm gonna do blue and magenta, okay? So you're not gonna get the same cool watery effect, but you will still be able to put the colors down on the paper, right? So let's pretend that, oh, okay, you know, I want this darker area to be blue, right? You press harder where we want things to be darker. And as we want the color to change, we're gonna lighten up the pressure on our pencil. Okay, so I'm at like 30% pressure, I'm at like 10% pressure, right? And then eventually you wanna get it so that you're like barely touching the page. My pencil's barely on the page now. Come in with your other color, right? Start darker where you want it darkest. And then as it comes down to meet the other color, we're gonna go lighter and lighter. And the only thing I'm changing is I'm just changing how hard I'm pressing with my pencil. And then eventually by the time I reach that darker section of blue, I want it to be like it's barely on the page. All right, so if you don't have watercolor at home, you can also patch this together like this, and it will also still create a really cool effect. So now we're just gonna be kind of working section by section. Doing a lot of purple. I think I'm gonna put in some blue just to switch it up. So remember, you wanna keep your sort of cool, darker colors for shadow tones. Keep your warmer, lighter colors for more of the mid-tone. All right, now all I'm doing is I'm putting down plain water, getting my paint on my brush over by the palette, and I'm dabbing it in, just letting it flow through the water with what I have set up, okay? Sometimes the water gets a mind of its own and it wants to go into different places, and that's okay. It's kind of some of the cool things about watercolor. So you can just kind of let it flow through and see what it does. Ultimately, you'll still get something really cool at the end of this. I think I'm gonna throw in a little bit of red up here. It's lighter as it goes towards the top, so I'm gonna dab in some yellow. Still creating a nice edge. And then as things dry, you can also go back in and you can add in a little bit more tone. All right, so I noticed that this eye is looking pretty dry. I'm gonna add in a little bit more of that purple that I want. Also gonna add in a little bit of that shadow underneath. Just let that blend in to the wet paint we already have. All right, I can go up here a little bit. Doesn't have to be super exact. All right, and remember, if I want it darker, I just have to get more pigment, right, more of the paint on my brush and less water. And that'll make it darker. I'm also making sure I'm paying attention as well to where my light spots are, because you can't really erase watercolor. It's very tricky to do so. So I'm trying to just leave those white spaces as I work and not accidentally cover them up. And your watercolor might get a little bit dirty. That's okay. If it really bothers you, you can always go and get new water. We're just going to take this time to sort of start working through adding in color. Whatever colors make sense and ones that you feel like using. All right, see, I connected the two waters together, so now it wants to come over here, which is fine. I'm also just going to bring out this color a little bit. All I'm doing is I'm just working with plain water. I'm just bringing it over. Already this side has started to dry, right? And you can see how the two colors are both a lot lighter than we are working with, and they've sort of dried together. Like I mentioned at the beginning, if you have any suggestions or things that you would really like to see from us during this time, please send us an email. We've already gotten some really lovely suggestions. Now, another big thing with watercolors, you kind of have to let it do what it wants a little bit, right? You can decide where you want to put the pigment. But with this technique, after a while, you just kind of have to let it move and dry the way that it wants to. So again, working in the eye, leaving space for the highlight that I want. Start putting in my darker color. We're going to be defining a lot of these facial features later with our darker color pencil once everything is dry. So it's okay if it's a little bit nebulous right now. I'm still paying really close attention to my highlights and shadows though, in my reference picture. Okay? Which will still give us a little bit of realism. I tend to really like cool colors, but if you want to put more warm colors in yours, you are welcome to. And again, if you have color pencils, just keep blending in and putting in the colors that you want. And if you get a couple paint splashes at the top, that's okay. Adds a little bit of flavor. So remember, all I'm doing is I'm just putting down light base, right? Nice water base. And I'm going over to my palette and I'm dabbing in the pigment that I need. So I dip my brush in, little excess, go over to the palette, mix it in, and then I just let it sink into the watercolor. Putting a little bit of blue next to this orange because they are opposite colors on the color wheel, which just means that they are directly across from each other. And when you put opposite colors together, they look really vibrant. Other opposite colors are going to be purple and yellow, and red and green. All right, I'm gonna work on my jaw. So we're definitely gonna need some of that orangey color down by the bottom. It's okay if you accidentally put a little bit too much on there, because remember it's gonna dry a lot lighter. I'm leaving a little bit of extra space because I want to be able to put that shadow in underneath. Just working up against that line. Letting it fade in. Bringing a little bit of that shadow tone up here. Work a little bit on the ears. This inner bit's quite orange. Okay. Put a little bit of that dark edge up against it. I'm just going to keep working in. You can let your colors mix together. See what happens. If you see something that you missed earlier, you can always go back in and add it. Right? Want a little bit more definition in here. Right, a little bit more of the muscle coming in over here. And if you don't like the way something looks, you just take a little bit of plain water. Let it come out. Okay, we're almost done with the first part of this. Again, plain water. Pigment. Just letting it blend together and come down how it wants to. You can always go back in and add pigment too if you decide something's drying that you want it to be a little bit more bold. The nice thing about watercolor is you can layer it. So you would just repeat the same process. Okay, it's a pretty good stopping point for this part of the piece. You probably have your own pieces at home that also need to dry. So in the meantime, I want to talk a little bit about different watercolor techniques while everything is drying. A separate sheet of paper. Okay, so there's a few things you can do with watercolor. A lot of things you can do with watercolor. There's something that's called wet on wet, which is what we've been doing, okay? And that's when you take plain water and you wet your paper so that it's just glistening. You don't want like a huge puddle, okay? And then you can go over to your palette, right? Water. Dab it in, and then you let the pigment go to the wet area of the paper. That's called wet on wet. That's what we've been doing. And each technique has its own advantages, right? This is going to create like a really nice, even tone, right? You can also do it to create a really nice base layer for whatever painting you're working on. Or you can also create more of that water drip effect that we've been doing and let the different colors merge together. You can do that if you want to. There's also wet on dry, which is when you just go straight ahead with the color that you're interested in. Again, you wet your brush, mix the brush in with the pigment, and then you just go directly onto the paper. And you're gonna get a much bolder color. Do you see how this is quite faded, quite muted? This is quite strong, okay? And again, that's great when you want to start going with some of your medium and dark tones, right? You could just as easily make this your light base layer. Once that dries, you can come in, right? Something darker. If I wanted to, right? I can go just directly into the wet pigment. Put right up next to it. Right, make a nice shadow tone. Okay. And in terms of blending with watercolor, you can either work while the color is still wet, like this, and the two paint colors will just sort of mix together, or if you have two sections that are dry, put a dry section over here. All you have to do is just take a little bit of plain water, just kind of like squiggle the two together. A little bit harder to do, so it's typically just easier if you do it while it's still wet. So you get a really nice gradient. You can also technically try to do dry on dry, right? You're gonna get a much more textured effect, right? Because what it's doing is it's picking up the bumps of the paper on top of it. Right, which is nice if you want more of a textured effect. If you have salt at home, you can also place salt down on top. The salt's going to absorb some of the moisture as it dries, and it's going to create a really cool sort of snowflake effect. All right, so those are just some of the few different techniques. We've been doing a lot of wet on wet, but again, you could do wet on dry, which is just taking the paint and going straight onto the paper, right? Or you could even do like quote unquote dry on dry, which is when you have very little water in your paint palette and you go right in with the pigment, and it creates sort of a really nice textured effect. Okay, but just like we like to do in class, we typically, if you were to do a realistic watercolor piece, you want to start with a light tone, okay, which is a lot of water, very little pigment. Let it dry, and then build up to your medium tone, then to your dark tone, and then put in the details, and so on. Take a quick look. Okay, we've got a few parts that are still wet, but we can start going in with a couple detail bits. Okay, so if you have a color pencil, right, I highly recommend it. You could also do dark brown if you really want to. I find the black shows up the best with this. All right, so now we're just gonna pick a few areas to do detail work, right? On the example, it's not everywhere, right? We really let the paint show through. We're really just gonna focus on like the eyes, nose, mouth area, and then a couple other spacing areas as well. Okay? So let's take a look at the eyes. Remember I said beforehand, right, your eyes are gonna be quite dark, and we wanna leave that area for the highlight. So we're gonna press up against the area pretty hard where you want that highlight to be, okay? And then around the upper edge of the eye. Then I'm almost going to skip a little line. Okay, go up and start working on that eyelid. I'm doing a gentle blend in between these two. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get the really cool watercolor effect, but you still get the nice definition that comes with a colored pencil as well. All right, putting a shadow up around the top of the eye. Right, then I can lighten up a little bit towards the middle. Working from that bottom edge. Right, harder at the bottom edge. Working up towards that upper corner that we drew out beforehand. Okay, skipping a little bit, so there's that little bit of a highlight around the eye, around that water line. All right, so I'm leaving room for that highlight. All right, then we have a really strong highlight and then a shadow underneath. So again, I'm gonna skip, put a little shadow underneath. Right, if you're working with a toned paper like this and you didn't quite leave white for a highlight, what you do is you just make your shadow a little bit darker, and then that'll make the other part that you're not shading in look lighter. It's all relative how things work together. Again, leaving room for a little bit of highlight at the top of this eye. If you had white charcoal, you could try and add in the detail that way. It's not going to work great with a white colored pencil, but you're welcome to try it. All right, it's quite dark over here. Just adding in a little bit of extra tone over here, because this helps tell us that the eye, all right, is in a socket in the skull, and it's not just sitting flat on the face when we put in this shadow over here. So we're really just picking a few areas of interest and areas that helps tell us a little bit about the anatomy and how everything is situated together. Okay? I'm gonna put a little extra shadow right around the mouth here. right? Because if you think about it, right, the snout's coming forward, so the rest of the face is going backwards. So we're going to put a little bit of a shadow tone to help define that. If you really wanted to, you could work around these little strands up here. What you would do is you would just give them a little bit of definition, right? So I'm kind of working around them. I'm not drawing them in, I'm drawing in the space around them. I'm going to work a little bit on the nose. Should I take that back? I'm going to work on this side. The nose is still a little bit wet. Again, putting in that darker shadow over here. Working over by the eye. Remember we said we want to press up hard against that highlight. Hard up against the top. A little lighter towards the middle. And again, if you wanted to draw in that fur texture, you could. I'm going to leave it out for clarity, right? Skip a little bit, room for that upper lid, short blend. Right, with a quite dark eyelid over towards the side. So I'm going to press in hard. Working from the bottom lid. Remember leaving a little bit of highlight before putting in the shadow. If you try to do this in an area where it's still drying, your pencil's not going to quite work as well. So give it some time. You can sort of just gently tap with the back of your finger to see what's still wet. It's like if I'm tapping, snout's still pretty wet down there, right? And I accidentally splattered and moved some stuff around, but it actually looks pretty cool. So we're okay. You could also do this, if it was completely dry, you could do this with a pen if you wanted to. You could also do this with a, like a really, really thin detailed brush, not like this if it was very thin with a point to it. And if you had black in your palette, you could do this with black if you really wanted to. Easiest way is with colored pencils. So we need a little bit of tone up by the nose. Right, if you want a little extra tone in spaces where it's kind of light, just don't press as hard with your pencil. All right, we can always control our pressure. All right, I'm gonna press really hard where I need the nostrils to be. this is still a little bit wet, so I can't quite get as dark as I would like for it to be. So I'll come back to the nose in a bit, but I can help define out the mouth a little bit. Just a little bit with my black. Put a little shadow spacing right up where the ear would be. Right, if something comes in front of something else, you gotta put a shadow with whatever's behind. You always press hardest with the shadow, right where the two things touch, and then the shadow fades out as it goes towards the edges. Still quite wet. And I'm just going through and I'm still just piecing in where I see it dark and where I think we need a little bit of extra detail. If you really wanted to, you could also do a few whiskers on this dog. I'm doing a textured stroke, which means I'm just pressing a little bit harder at the beginning and getting a little lighter towards the edges. Now for this one, if we have a dark edge that already exists on this face, okay, we're gonna leave it light here. We always wanna have a setup where it's shadows and highlights playing off of each other, okay? So if you already have a really strong shadow, you don't need to put a second one in. You're gonna leave a little bit of space for a highlight and then just put the shadow in a little bit further over.